What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch back here with another fantasy football stardom and situm, the final one of the 2019 fantasy football season. Congratulations, you've made it to your fantasy championship, and in this video, I will help you bring that championship home with my starts and my sits at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions. Before I dive into my starts and my sits, make sure that you do, as always, Gronk spike the like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more fantasy football videos just like this, as well as more NFL content, as I'll have the entire NFL playoffs covered on the channel. Dive in the comment section. Let me know your questions. What's your big question? Start and sit question going into week 16, going into the championship. What question do you need to be answered? What advice do you need on your fantasy lineup? Let me know in the comment section below. And as always, guys, help the rest of the community, the rest of the commenters below on their fantasy lineup, because my opinion is not the only opinion that matters on this channel. Your opinion matters just as much. So get in that comment section and help everybody in the comments win their fantasy championship. Let's win some fantasy championships. Let's go. Let's start off my quarterback stardom and situm with the quarterback position. Kyler Murray takes on the Seattle Seahawks in a NFC West game in Seattle. Seattle is 10-point favorites, which means that I expect Kyler Murray to have plenty of time in the fourth quarter and the second half to be able to pass the football in this game. Not to mention, Seattle's susceptible versus the pass. They allow the fourth most passing yards per game this season, and over the past three, they allow 27 points per game. Not to mention, Kyler Murray is a scrambling quarterback playing a defense that allows the seventh most rushing yards to the quarterback position. He's been playing very well, and it's kind of snuck under the radar. Kyler Murray should have a really good game this week versus the Seattle secondary that primarily only plays zone. They don't play a lot of man, and I think Kyler Murray could eat it up versus a team that's a little beat up on the defensive side of the football. Kirk Cousins versus Green Bay. You always know that you have to score when you're a quarterback playing the Packers. He has Adam Thielen back. So he has all the arsenal in the world for the passing game to be successful versus Green Bay. This isn't the same Green Bay secondary that they played the first time around. Not to mention, Cousins is excellent at home. He's thrown 10 touchdowns. He has a 126 passer rating at home, and he's only thrown one interception. So Cousins, if this game becomes somewhat of a shootout, I would expect him to have a big game. Dak Prescott versus the Eagles, the NFC East defining game of 2019. Dak Prescott has lit up the Philadelphia Eagles. The Cowboys have beat them 3 times in a row, and a big reason is because of Dak. Really, I'm not concerned about the injury. I think he will lift them past the Eagles. In the first meeting, 1 touchdown on the ground, 1 touchdown through the air, a 100 passer rating, a 77 completion percentage. Dak is efficient and effective versus the Eagles. The Eagles have also been pretty bad as of late. They've allowed the 10th most passing yards, the 3rd most passing touchdowns, and that's versus some pretty bad offenses. Phillip Rivers versus the Oakland Raiders. The Raiders allow the 2nd most passing touchdowns per game, the 6th most passing yards per game, and the 2nd highest passer rating per game. I would love to pick up Phillip Rivers if you're in need of a quarterback, and even if you're kind of don't know who to start, I think Rivers is a safe option this week. Matt Ryan versus Jacksonville. Speak about a safe option. Atlanta's at home in a dome, a good environment for Matt Ryan. Obviously, he's used to it. And Jacksonville's not a very good defense. Atlanta's a 7-point favorite. There should be points scored in this game on both sides, which means Matt Ryan has a threat of throwing for 300 yards for 3 touchdowns in this football game. I don't really see anybody that can cover Julio on the opposite side, and this is a defense that's very simplistic. I think Matt Ryan, as a veteran quarterback, can decipher it and go through his reads and be effective. And Jameis Winston versus Houston. I understand there's no Mike Evans. I understand there's no Godwin, but there is Perryman. There is Howard, there is Brait, And Bruce Arians still loves to throw the ball down the field. He wants to attack you in the secondary. And Houston is not a good secondary. They don't have a good secondary, and they give up a lot of big passing plays. Houston has allowed the second most points to quarterbacks this season. They've allowed the third most touchdowns to quarterback this season. And they've only picked off the third least amount of interceptions. So that being said, with a quarterback like Jameis Winston, who throws a lot of interceptions, versus a team that's unlikely to pick off a lot of passes, it does help that Jameis could throw for his 3 touchdowns or his 4 touchdowns or his 450 yards, but maybe keep the interception total down as opposed to having it at the same level as those incredible touchdowns that help your fantasy team. My quarterback sit-ems, I have Tom Brady versus the Buffalo Bills. Sorry, Patriots fans, it hurts to say, but Tom Brady is not a guy I want to play on championship weekend. I just don't. I mean, he's playing the Bills. They give up they have the second best passer rating this season versus quarterbacks. 76 passer rating this season. They've allowed the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. And in the last 2 games versus Buffalo, Brady has been very ineffective. He's thrown 3 picks, which is very rare of Tom Brady. He doesn't turn the ball over much, but versus Buffalo, he does turn the ball over at least once a game, it seems like, versus Sean McDermott's defense. So I don't love the matchup. The Patriots offense has been struggling. I think you sit Tom Brady down for your championship. Josh Allen versus New England. Let's flip it to the other side. Well, I said Buffalo was second in passer rating. I said they were second in the fewest points allowed. Well, New England is first. They have a 57 passer rating allowed. That's incredible. 57. That's the worst by far in the NFL in terms of quarterbacks versus a defense. That's 19 points better than second place Buffalo. Allen threw 3 picks versus New England the first time around. This time it's in New England instead of Buffalo. I don't expect it to be very easy despite them not having Jonathan Jones in this game. Jared Goff versus San Francisco. The 49ers dismantled Goff and the Rams offense the first time they played. San Francisco is second in sacks. They are first in adjusted sack rate, which means they get a lot of pressure after opposing quarterbacks. Goff is one of the worst quarterbacks under pressure. Don't love this matchup. Baker Mayfield versus Baltimore. Are the Cleveland Browns even trying? Odell, Jarvis are trying to get traded to other teams. This is a quarterback that's playing with 2 receivers that don't want to play for the Browns. He plays versus Baltimore, who ranks 4th best in pass defense DVOA and 3rd best in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback. So I really don't like Baker Mayfield this week. I think the only way Cleveland's effective is on the ground and not through the air. Sam Darnold versus Pittsburgh. The Steelers rank 2nd in adjusted sack rate and are tied for 1st in sacks this season. The Jets have the 3rd worst offensive line according to adjusted sack rate, so Pittsburgh should be able to get pressure after Sam Darnold, who just like Josh Allen and Jared Goff, not very good versus pressure in their face. Also, Pittsburgh just in general is a really good defense. They're top 3 versus the pass. I'd probably sit down Sammy Boy for your championship. And Derek Carr versus the Chargers. He's been pretty bad as of late, but the Chargers are quite good versus the pass. Actually underrated versus the pass. We know they have a strong pass rush, but their secondary is good as well. They rank 4th worst matchup versus quarterbacks this season in fantasy points allowed. Derek Carr, the struggling that we've seen from him, I think will continue versus the Chargers. My running back starts this week. Devontae Freeman versus Jacksonville. The Jags have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs this season and the 2nd most touchdowns. Also the 4th most yards per game. So Devontae Freeman, if there's a week where he really has a huge week this season, in a season full of up and downs, this should be an up week, and I would like him as a flex in your lineup. Joe Mixon versus Miami. Mixon has been really good of late, including versus the Patriots. This week he plays a Miami team that is allowing a league-high 5 yards in adjusted line yards this season. That means they have the worst push up front on the defensive line, so they're not really going to stuff runs behind the backfield. They're not really going to be able to get that nice effective push on an offensive line, and they've allowed the third most fantasy points to their running back position. Joe Mixon, the offense runs through him. I expect him to have a big game here versus Miami in Miami. Marlon Mack versus Carolina. The Panthers defense, they've allowed a top 11 fantasy running back in 6 of the last 7 games. They've allowed the most fantasy points to running backs this season and an astronomical 23 rushing touchdowns. That is 9 more than the second worst team. That's as many touchdowns as Randy Moss had in 2007. Marlon Mack is a must start this week. And Boone versus Green Bay. Now, this is a asterisk beside it, of course. Dalvin Cook is expected not to play. I don't know if Alexander Mattison is playing. If neither of them are playing, you must pick up Boone to play. Now, if he's not picked up in your league, do it right now just in case. If you have Cook, put Boone in your lineup, because if Cook doesn't play, you want Boone out there. If Madison, you have him and you're expecting to play him and you don't know if he's going to play, pick up Boone. So he is kind of that guy that you need to have on the back burner so that you're prepared if you need to put him in your lineup. That's the type of guy you want. Boone, he actually has a really good matchup if he is the lead back for the Vikings. The Packers are very bad versus the run. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to the position and the 2nd most adjusted line yards, the 2nd most touchdowns as well. So the Packers are just susceptible big time to the running game. And no matter the starter for the Vikings, I think it's a good start. Kareem Hunt versus Baltimore. Not a bad flex this week. If the Browns have any chance of winning this game, it will be by running the ball. Hunt has finished as a top 16 running back all but 1 game since he's come back from suspension. That's 5 out of 6 games. Baltimore is actually more susceptible than you think versus the run. They're only 21st versus the run this season in DVOA, meaning that on average, they're not a very good run defense. Cleveland took advantage of it the first time they played. I would expect them to attack it again this week. Like I said, I don't think Baker will have a good game, but I think the Browns might have some success on the ground with Chubb and with Hunt. My running back sits Carlos Hyde versus Tampa Bay. Tampa is by far the best run defense in the league. They've allowed the least amount of fantasy points to their running back this season, only 789 rushing yards on the season, which is insane. They have nearly 150 less yards than the second best run defense. Ronald Jones versus Houston. I don't trust this backfield in general in my fantasy championship, so if you're looking at a Barber or a Jones in your flex, I would probably shy away from it. Houston is not bad versus the run, and Jones in particular has really failed to score double-digit fantasy points in 3 straight games, so he hasn't been effective. This is a split, and I don't see either of these guys having a great game. Le'Veon Bell versus Pittsburgh. I see no revenge game here. Pittsburgh ranks 6th versus the run. And when I look at it from a physical standpoint, I just believe that the Pittsburgh Steelers defensive line will dominate the Jets offensive line, and there will be no run lanes for Le'Veon Bell to go through or to explode through or to make plays through. Montgomery versus the Kansas City Chiefs. This could be a blowout. I could see the Chiefs blowing out the Bears. And if that's the case, I don't want Montgomery on my lineup because they're not going to run the ball. And Nagy, he's going to try and pull out all the passing plays, all the trick plays, all the big time crazy things versus Andy Reid because that's his mentor and he wants to impress his mentor and he wants to impress his idol. So Montgomery's not going to touch the ball a lot. But also, if this does become a blowout, I don't like his odds. As well as the fact that the Chiefs have actually been a pretty good run defense as of late. Over the past 3 games, they're allowing the 3rd least amount of rushing yards, 89 per game. I just think overall this is a risky play any way you slice it. And my last sit is LaShawn McCoy versus the Chicago Bears. They allow the 6th fewest rushing yards in the NFL this season. McCoy is in a crowded backfield. They split carries all the time. He's not as electric as he used to be. I would sit Shady. A great running back of this decade, but not this year. Wide receiver stardom. Perryman versus Houston. Winston's new number 1 is going to be Perryman on Saturday. And I believe you have to start the Tampa Bay number one wide receiver. Perryman has been pretty consistent even without being the number one. He has at least 70 yards in 3 straight games. He's seeing the targets, he's getting thrown to, and he's having and being effective. Houston allows the 5th most passing yards per game, so I see Perryman continuing that trend for a 4th game. Mike Williams versus Oakland. Williams has been really, really good as of late, and nobody's paying attention. He's one of the best jump ball receivers in the entire NFL, and Oakland allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver. Will Fuller versus Tampa Bay. Big plays, baby. Count on it for Week 16 with Will Fuller. Tampa Bay has allowed the most yards and the 2nd most touchdowns to the wide receiver position. Will Fuller should have a massive game, especially considering Tampa Bay will likely double or pay extra attention to DeAndre Hopkins. Tyler Boyd versus Miami. They're one of the worst teams versus slot receiver. Indeed, they're actually the worst team versus a slot receiver. They allow the most touchdowns in the NFL to the slot receiver with 13. Tyler Boyd largely lines up in the slot. Tyler Boyd is the number one for the Bengals and should see a big bounce back week without Stephon Gilmore covering him. Terry McLaurin versus the New York Giants. This is a perfect matchup for Terry in this game. Scary Terry, I'm still going to call him. I don't care if you change his nickname because it's too good to change it. They allow the most touchdown catches to wide receivers, and they have given up 14 deep touchdown receptions, which is the most in the NFL. So not only are the Giants giving up the 2nd highest rate of touchdowns, but deep down the field, which Scary Terry, that's where he got his nickname, that's what he does, that's where Haskins is going to target him. The Giants give up the most, 14. I think you need to start this guy because if you don't, he could potentially have a massive game on your bench. And I think it's worth the risk even if he does have somehow a bad game. Wide receiver, sit him. John Brown versus New England. Stephon Gilmore. Do I need to say anything else? I mean, he ranks 1st in the least fantasy points allowed, the lowest passer rating allowed, and the lowest completion percentage allowed for any corner in the NFL. Stephon Gilmore is the defensive player of the year. I'm not starting any receiver. I don't care if it's Jerry Rice. Odell Beckham Jr. versus the Baltimore Ravens. Does he even want to play at this point? I know he's injured, but I don't think he wants to play for the Browns. Him and Baker lack any chemistry. I don't think he likes the coach very much in Freddie Kitchens, who's about to get fired. Plus, Odell only had 2 catches for 20 yards versus Marlon Humphrey the first time around, who's a really underrated corner. I don't expect him to have many yards in this game. Who knows, maybe he does, but I'm just not worth risking my fantasy championship for the drama of the Cleveland Browns. Julian Edelman versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, I love Edelman, and he's been very good for you for fantasy, and it's going to be tough to sit him. But he does play the Bills, which are the 2nd best team versus a wide receiver. For a large majority of the game, Tre'Davious White, who's one of the best corners in the league. And then 3rd, he's banged up. He's hurt. Did you watch him in the Bengals game? He could barely move. So that being said, I think he's going to be limited all week in practice. He's just going to go out there to be a decoy to draw double teams. I don't see him having a huge game here, even if he is healthy. So it's worth sitting him for a player that maybe has a higher ceiling. Tyrell Williams versus the Chargers. He's going to see a lot of Casey Hayward, who is still one of the best corners in the game. Tyrell Williams has sucked lately. Derek Carr has sucked lately. And the Raiders suck. The Chargers have allowed the 3rd fewest points to the wide receiver position, which is going under the radar. And I don't believe Tyrell Williams will break that trend. And my last sit at the wide receiver position is Kenny Golladay versus Chris Harris and the Denver Broncos. Now, like I said, Chris Harris will be covering him for a large majority of the snaps in this game. The Broncos are also top 10 versus wide receivers this season, and Golladay has struggled with the 3rd-string quarterback of the Lions. My tight end stardom is Hunter Henry versus Oakland. The Raiders allow the 2nd most points this season to the tight end position. Hunter Henry in a game where Phillip Rivers should be able to eat. Like I said, he should be able to have time. Hunter Henry should have at least a touchdown or at least around 60 to 100 yards in this game. Jacob Hollister versus Arizona. Hollister is interesting because he's actually been heavily utilized in this offense. And now without Josh Gordon there, he's probably only going to see more targets. The Cardinals are the absolute worst team versus the tight end. They have allowed 15 tight end touchdowns this season. That's 6 more than the second worst team versus the tight end. That's awful, guys. So if you need a flex or if you need a tight end, Hollister is your guy. Definitely go after Hollister if he's still out there. Kyle Rudolph versus Green Bay. Some people don't like this matchup. I'm in favor of it. There's 2 reasons I like Rudolph here. He's really a good bailout option. So if you have Boone and then, oh my goodness, Madison's going to play, then maybe you could just start Rudolph because Rudolph doesn't have a bad matchup. Actually, you look at the matchup, the Packers have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends this year. So they're in the top 10 for most fantasy points allowed. Like I said, this should be an air show from Kirk Cousins more than a ground game, even though the running back position usually goes off versus Green Bay. I think it's not a bad start, and I could see Rudolph scoring a touchdown in this game. So if you need the bailout option, or if you're desperate at the tight end, I would go with Kyle Rudolph. Noah Fant versus Detroit. Drew Lock loves Noah Fant, and I don't think this is really a great matchup. Detroit is 16th or 15th with the most fantasy points allowed to tight end. So they're about average versus the tight end position. But Fant's a beast. He's getting a lot of targets in this offense. He's a big part of this offense. I would say he's the second target behind Courtland Sutton. And if he's healthy, and Drew Lock, they're favorites by 7 points. They're expected to score. They're at home. I'd expect Fant to be a sneaky start at the tight end position this week. And my last start of the 2019 season is Dallas Goedert versus the Dallas Cowboys. Funny. But Dallas Goedert, I expect to get quite a few targets in this game because the Eagles don't really have any options at wide receiver. And outside of Zach Ertz, somebody needs to catch the ball. If I recall correctly, Goedert had one of his best games of the season versus Dallas, even in a game where Philly wasn't very competitive. I expect this week Goedert could have a pretty good game as well. Maybe a touchdown, maybe 6 to 8 receptions, because Carson Wentz is going to need to throw the ball, especially in a game where I do expect Dallas to win and probably be leading for a majority of it, which means that the Eagles will have more incentive to pass the ball. So more targets for Dallas Goedert and another sneaky start for you at the tight end position. There you go, guys. Those are my starts and my sits for Week 16, your fantasy championship week 2019 fantasy football. I enjoyed the season. I hope you did too. If you guys have any opinion on the starts and sits for next year or any sort of fantasy content going forward that you'd like to comment below that I can do to improve the channel or to help you guys out to the next level, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. It's been Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Peace out.